I'm delighted to say we are joined by Alfie Stirling, who is the head of economics at the New Economics Foundation on behalf of the left, and Alex Phillips for the right, former Brexit Party MEP. Folks, welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be on.
Alfie, there is the very strong sense that the government has reached the next stage now of its battle in the pandemic, and that is about getting Britain moving again. What's your view on that?
Yeah, it's clear that they've chosen to start unwinding over the last few days. I think that, to be honest, it's very risky. The UK was late going into its lockdown compared to other countries with comparable populations, comparable health services. And so it's inevitable, really, that we should be late coming out. On top of that, we've also had a less severe lockdown. And so I think government is taking a big risk here with public health. I think there clearly has to be a balance, and we do have to start to get back to a new normal as fast as we can. But to be honest, at the moment, the ambiguity around the instructions, the lack of support to help people have clear rights at work, the lack of provision in public transport, these things all suggest to me that we're doing things too quickly and we're getting the balance wrong between public health and pushing people back to work too early.
Well, Alfie, it's an impossible choice, isn't it, for the government, really? They're damned if they do and damned if they don't. If they tell everyone just to stay at home, which is a really clear instruction, then the economy will tank. And if they tell everyone the pandemic's over, then we'll get a second peak. Not an easy position.
No, but I don't think it's the binary between those two things. It's all about timing and then the manner in which you slowly unlock. So, for example, one thing that's key about the economy right now is that although activities aren't going on, one of the ways you can protect incomes and make sure that the economy bounces back, even if we do unlock a bit later, is to maintain pounds in people's pockets, make sure that the social security system is strong enough, make sure that people are being reimbursed for the work they're not able to do, whether through income protection schemes or other programs. And those haven't been strong enough. The job retention scheme has been really good, but too many people, millions at the moment, more than 2 million people, are having to rely on universal credit, which is far too weak. If that was stronger, we could actually afford people to stay at home a bit longer because they'd have the spending power when they came back for jobs to be created.
Of course, Alfie, I know that you and your team at the New Economics Foundation would be the first to agree with Alex that poverty and inequality is a big driver of disease and indeed, sadly, death as well. So do you accept this notion that if we absolutely crash the economy into a brick wall, that when this pandemic is over, there'll be a different kind of crisis and there will be death at the same time, but it will be economically driven rather than viral?
It's completely true that poverty and inequality can be fatal, and if they're not fatal, it can still ruin lives and livelihoods for the long term. But that isn't exactly the same as saying, look, we're in recession, therefore it's going to cause fatalities or public health crises in and of itself. Actually, what really matters is the distribution of income across the country, and even in a recession, there is huge amounts government can do, if it wants to, if it has the political will to do so, to intervene to protect the most vulnerable. And that's how you prevent recessions causing their own public health or mental health crises. And we haven't seen enough of that at the moment. So it's not as simple as to say, the economy slowing down inevitably leads to lower well-being and lower livelihoods. The link is not that simple, and government can do a lot to protect people if it chooses to.
But do you think there is a shelf life the government will, has to sort of face in terms of how much money it can continue to borrow for the foreseeable? I mean, surely this can't go on into next year.
Well, the interesting thing about this is that a lot of commentators talk about public borrowing as being this ultimate constraint that we're about to burst and we're going to have to wind back. The truth is, it simply isn't the case that public borrowing is the immediate constraint in terms of economics. There is no mainstream economist who will tell you that is the main thing to worry about right now. And the reason for that is very simple. Many people point to the fact that we're about to borrow, more than £200 billion this year, a big increase. But very few point out that every projection predicts that the cost of borrowing, the interest rate that we pay, not just on the new borrowing, but on all of our debts historically, will be lower next year than it has at any time since records begun. So it's worth repeating that. Our cost of borrowing is at record lows. So it's not a constraint at the moment.
No.
The ultimate constraint of borrowing is inflation. So if there's too much money in the economy, or there can be other supply side factors too, but if there's too much money in the economy, then inflation goes up. But again, when you're in a recession, when there's actually lots of people looking to get back to work, to produce goods, inflation is not your problem. Your problem is getting pounds into people's pockets to create the jobs that we all need.
Matt Hancock doesn't quite commit to giving nurses a pay rise, but says, and quotes, he believes strongly nursing is a skilled profession and deserves decent pay. He will fight to that fair reward. What kind of hearing do you think he'll get in the cabinet for that?
Well, I think actually, the public sector shouldn't necessarily run itself on the basis of, short-term reward and then what does it do next? Kind of cut pay if there are kind of mistakes further down the line. I think you need to have a sustainable framework for pay going forward. And if you look at the the latest analysis on this, if you compare public sector workers, like for like with their private sector counterparts, after adjusting for things like qualification, where in the country you live, public sector workers are systematically paid less than in the private sector. And it's those sorts of arguments that should really be informing the correct benchmarking of pay. And on top of that, at a moment like now, actually boosting public sector pay will boost private sector incomes as well, because where do those people spend those pay packets? They spend them in the private market, going to the shops, shopping online, going purchasing goods from private companies, and it will boost the incomes in the private sector as well.
I mean, given that the government have more or less underwritten the British economy, are we all socialists now, Alfie?
Well, I think the word socialist can often be more than a bit problematic. The point that really is key to make is that government has stepped in a really big way, and in a way that is entirely unprecedented in recent kind of UK past. We've moved from a model of government maintaining a really quite dire minimum subsistence kind of standard of living if you lose work, to one where we're actually prepared to guarantee pay a proportion of wages when you're in work. That's the kind of European insurance model that many on the continent have had for decades, and that is a big shift. I wouldn't say, I don't think talking about kind of entire kind of shift towards socialism or not, but it's certainly within the kind of frameworks of international management of economy. That's a big shift, and actually it'd be really important to keep going in that direction in order to maintain the kind of security, the kind of resilience across the economy that many European economies enjoy.
Alfie, do you hope that nations can work collaboratively going forward, given that more or less no one is solvent anymore, that somehow we could pool resources as nations and mitigate a global depression?
Yeah, I think Alex is completely spot on there. I think that international, cooperation and coordination has been one of the strong features of this past few months. It's one of the few positives, I'd say, of what it was otherwise been a very miserable period for most of the world. And I really do hope that it signals a step change in the way international relations are coordinated. Of course, there are also examples of it not going so well, including the way that our government has interacted with the European Union and been late to engage with processes that allowed, early access to PPE and other sorts of facilities. But overall, that's definitely been the shift. And I think that if we can move to a world where it's about cooperation rather than necessarily a bottom, a drive to the bottom and for competition, that would be incredibly positive.
Alfie, do you think that the Europeans will compromise in these negotiations, given the parlous state of the world economy and the fact that Germany, for example, has entered recession and has shrunk by 2.5%, with worse to come?
I mean, it's incredibly hard to speculate over what either side of the negotiating table will do, as has been demonstrated over the last 3 years. Anyone that tries to predict it tends to get it wrong. But I'm sure that there will be efforts to try and extend the negotiation beyond the arbitrary deadline at the end of this year. But to be honest with you, stepping back a bit, I actually think that the really important thing about these last few months is it's shown just how unimportant, quite frankly, Brexit is compared to these bigger decisions of life and death that have always been under domestic policy control and will continue to be so. Things like going into a pandemic with a £10 billion funding gap in our public care services. These sorts of things are entirely under domestic control, and these are the things that have proven to be the actual fundamental tenets of a healthy society, which we've been getting wrong for years.
We've dealt with an issue around Brexit and possibly the right of politics with Alex. Alfie, in a few seconds that remain in the hour, is now not the time for teaching unions to play politics with getting Britain's schools back open?
It's interesting that kind of talking about playing politics, because I see this as a question that we should experts on, just as we ask epidemiologists about the advice on pandemic control and we ask doctors about health.
Well, Jenny Harries just said on record at the briefing that the risk to school teachers is incredibly low, given that children are not susceptible to it and there aren't too many adults working in primary schools.
That's right, yeah, and teachers take a different view, and actually the British Medical Association also takes a different view and says that they believe the teachers' unions are right to be concerned about the risk. I'm not an expert in either, but I would certainly listen to those experts in forming a decision.